Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Four Fundamentals of Formative Assessment, sponsored by FastBridge Learning. Before we begin, I'd like to review just a few quick housekeeping items. We will be accepting questions throughout the webinar for a Q&A period at the end of the presentation. You can go ahead and send in your questions as they come up for you using the questions feature in your control panel. Just type your question into the top box and then click send, and I'll receive the question and I'll put it into the queue to be answered when we finish the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use that same questions feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the slide deck once we wrap up here. So keep an eye on your email tomorrow for details about how to access those materials. We'll also be posting them to the FastBridge website. So if for some reason the email that gets sent tomorrow ends up in your junk box, you can also hop over to the FastBridge site and find the recording and the slide deck. Now let's get started. I'm pleased to welcome today's speakers, Dr. Rachel Brown, Dr. John Belinsky, and Dr. Lynn M. Edwards. Rachel was a faculty member at the University of Southern Maine for 16 years and has authored multiple books and articles about multi-tier systems of support, response to intervention, and effective academic instruction. She is currently Senior Academic Officer at FastBridge Learning. Rachel is joined today by Dr. John Belinsky. He is FastBridge Learning's Senior Director of Research and Development and an educational research and test developer with expertise in differential item functioning, growth modeling, and diagnostic math assessment. For the past 7 years, John's professional work has focused on developing RTI and MTSS educational assessment systems and methodologies. Our final panelist today is Dr. Lynn M. Edwards, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Minnesota and is a school psychologist at an elementary charter school in Minneapolis. Lynn's current work is focused on leading the effort to develop and conduct research for the Personalized System of Instruction project in collaboration with her colleagues and FastBridge Learning. Our speakers have a lot of information to share with us today about formative assessment, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the program over to Dr. Rachel Brown to get us started.
Thank you, Emily. Well, we're very glad to have you all with us today, and I'm going to start off by going over what we hope will be the learning outcomes from today's session. We want to talk about some of the common misunderstandings about formative assessment and then what defines formative assessment. Then we'll transition to sharing some information about how formative assessment helps students. And then finally, how formative assessment fits into a multi-tiered system of support. So there are some common misunderstandings about what formative assessment is. And we thought we'd launch by just talking through those and get that addressed right off. So then we can move into what it is and how beneficial it can be for all students. So one very frequent myth we hear about formative assessment is that it is part of too much testing in schools. And certainly there are a number of tests given in schools. There always have been, and there always will be tests in schools. The issue is how much testing and when. And our argument is going to be that formative assessment itself isn't necessarily mean there's too much testing. However, educators do need to pay attention to the purposes and functions of the different assessments that they're using and help to find that right balance between some type of formative assessment as well as other assessments such as summative assessment or classroom-based assessment. So formative assessment by itself might not involve too much testing, but it could be that there's just too much testing overall. And we want folks to be thinking in terms of how formative assessment can contribute to a balanced approach to student assessment and learning. The next is the notion that formative assessment is going to interfere with instruction. And as you'll be learning about from Dr. Belinsky, in fact, many of our assessments are quite brief, and we don't think they necessarily interfere with instruction because they are done in as short a time as possible and they free up more time for instruction. Importantly, they provide information about how the student is doing so that we can make sure the instruction that's being provided is actually as effective as possible. And then there's also the notion that students don't like it. And I'll share a little bit more about how we don't necessarily think that's true. And finally, some folks might argue that the data are not useful and because they don't know what to do with it. And we'll also try to debunk that myth today. So let's go back to this idea of too much testing. Yes, it's possible there's too much testing in schools, but the key message is what we need are the right assessments. And formative assessment is specific to helping provide the right assessments because it's always paired with some aspect of the instruction. And then in that regard, formative assessment is different. And the key thing there is to know formative assessment is generally defined in relation to something that happens during instruction. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean in the middle of a lesson, but it does mean during the school year to inform the learning that students are having during the school year and what, if anything, needs to change about instruction. Then there's this other notion that formative assessment interferes with instruction. Well, it could sometimes. However, when done in a balanced way, formative assessment by definition is designed to complement instruction because it provides the feedback loop about how students are doing and whether or not adjustments to instruction are needed. Oftentimes I'm asked, well, don't students get tired of all that testing? They must not like this very much. Quite honestly, I have never had that experience in relation to the general principle of formative assessment. Now, certainly there are students who might not be thrilled to take a particular assessment on a particular day, but relative to providing assessments that literally complement instruction and which show the student how he or she is doing, my experience, and I've done thousands of these, is they really like it because it gives them a feedback loop on how they're doing. And in the cases where their skills are strengthening, which is the case most of the time, it also helps them to build confidence. So I've been a classroom teacher. I've also been a special educator and a school psychologist. And I have worked with many, many students who come to school and say, hey, do we get to do that test today? I want to see how much I've improved. Finally, there's the notion of the data not being useful. Certainly, any assessment data could lack in usefulness if the folks who are looking at the data don't know what it means. And part of the work at FastBridge Learning is to provide not only effective and efficient assessments, but also reports and other tools so that teachers can understand the data. Because it's very crucial that teachers have the right data at the right time, as well as opportunities to review the data. And that's a piece that is very important in terms of implementation within a tiered service model. Because if teachers don't have time to look at the data, yeah, it can feel very useless. And so we'll come back to that near to the end of our presentation today. So I'm going to pass the baton over to Dr. Belinsky, who's going to talk about the defining features of formative assessment.
Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon to all of the educators attending this webinar. You are really the reason we're here, and we truly hope that what you hear today will help you make informed decisions about formative assessment systems. I'm going to shift the focus to a critical element of formative assessment systems, namely progress monitoring. In order to help you understand why brevity, sensitivity, and validity are important qualities of progress monitoring, I will first briefly review the basic assessment elements of an MTSS system. In the context of MTSS, progress monitoring refers to frequent assessment, typically weekly, of students at risk. These are the students who are classified at risk based on their performance on a research-based and validated screener or interim assessment. Risk classification is determined by cut scores, which were themselves validated against an appropriate academic outcome. Typically, the domains of interest are foundational or early reading, reading fluency, reading comprehension, foundational math skills, math computation, and math problem solving. The screening data is also used to create custom intervention plans that target specific academic deficits. And students are often grouped according to instructional need. One component of the intervention plan is establishing performance goals and timelines to attain the goal for each student. Weekly assessments of students' progress using objectively scored and standardized assessments serves as an independent check of their progress. Progress monitoring data is also used to provide timely feedback of the effectiveness of instructional interventions. An intervention that is working is continued and may continue for the entire school year. An intervention that isn't working needs to be modified or replaced. Next slide, please. To limit interference with instruction, progress monitoring tests need to be brief and easy to score. The most common form of progress monitoring assessment is curriculum-based measurement, or CBM, and the most commonly used CBM is a 1-minute oral reading. The student reads aloud for 1 minute a passage or story that was carefully developed and standardized for her grade level. The teacher or other trained examiner simply records reading errors as the student reads. At the end of 1 minute, the reading errors are tallied and subtracted from the total number of words read to obtain a words read per minute score. Other reading and math CBM employ a similar procedure in which the number of errors is subtracted from the last item attempted to generate a units correct per minute score. Historically, CBM used paper-pencil administration with hand scoring. Now, most formative assessment systems use digital record forms. With digital record forms, the examiner clicks words not read correctly or words the student skipped. At the end of 1 minute, the examiner stops and submits the test, at which point the system computes the fluency score and an accuracy score, plots the scores on a graph, and stores the word reading errors in a report for further analysis. The scores and reports are designed to be easy to interpret. In fact, in many programs, the progress monitoring graphs are shared with students to provide a tangible means of communicating their success. Moreover, research shows that this feedback increases motivation and achievement. Next slide. High growth sensitivity is a hallmark of CBM and is essential for effective progress monitoring. Consider for a moment the effort and resources your school or district invest to close achievement gaps. Consider also the multitude of reading interventions that are available. Further, imagine that your job is to pair interventions to students based on their instructional needs. Your district wisely spent some of its limited resources on high-quality professional training for the specialists who will implement interventions in order to maximize fidelity and effectiveness. After screening is completed and students have been assigned to intervention groups, you wait in anxious anticipation to observe the impact of the interventions. And after 6 weeks, you run reports. And to your surprise, you see very little or no significant improvement. What happened? Were the interventions ineffective or poorly implemented? If the progress monitoring assessment has been validated for this purpose and has empirical evidence demonstrating sensitivity to short-term growth, you can confidently direct your attention and resources to improving the intervention or its delivery. On the other hand, if you cannot rule out the assessment as a culprit because it lacks validation and sensitivity evidence, the next steps are uncertain. You might abandon an intervention that is actually producing the desired effects. This would be unfortunate and costly, especially to the students. Sensitivity to growth over relatively brief intervals enables educators to confidently change course before investing inordinate time with an intervention that isn't working, or to stay the course when it is. Of all the assessments used to progress monitor reading improvement, there is none as robust and sensitive to reading growth in primary grades as oral reading fluency. With appropriate intervention, it is common for students to grow by 2 to 3 words per week, and this growth rate can be sustained for weeks. As such, after 6 weeks, you will know whether the intervention is having a positive effect on student achievement. You may be wondering whether this sensitivity translates into overall reading achievement growth. It does. There's a lot of empirical research demonstrating that higher growth rates on CBM reading are associated with better overall reading achievement after controlling for initial level performance. In other words, for 2 groups of students with the same initial level of performance, the group with the greater CBM reading growth rate will have a greater reading achievement score at the end of the year. You may also wonder how growth data can help with lesson planning. The simple answer is that if after 6 weeks of intervention, the student or groups are not demonstrating significant growth, a change to the intervention strategy is warranted. A more detailed explanation about the feedback loop will be covered later in this webinar. It is worth noting that high growth rates can only be achieved with skills that develop fairly rapidly. For this reason, CBM focused on basic or foundational skills, the skills that are prerequisites for higher order thinking skills, and that can develop fairly rapidly with a high quality intervention. This is also why broad achievement assessments don't work for frequent progress monitoring. The array of skills is so broad that if a student makes an improvement in one area, she may only encounter a handful of related test items, which is not sufficient for growth sensitivity. Next slide. Of course, a core property of any assessment is its validity. While there are many ways to evaluate validity, a common approach is to use another established test as criterion. CBM reading has been validated with a wide range of standardized reading assessments, including individually administered reading diagnostic tests, group administered reading achievement tests, computer adaptive reading assessments, and state reading tests. We quantify validity by the size of the correlation coefficient between two sets of scores. With a range from 0 to 1, a correlation of about 0.7 is considered good criterion validity evidence. A large corpus of empirical research has produced correlation coefficients in the range from the low 0.70s to low 0.80s for this 1-minute CBM reading score relative to reading achievement tests. Another way this CBM have been validated is using decision accuracy. For this analysis, we examine how accurately scores on CBM reading, for example, predict who will be proficient on state reading tests. Using a statistical model called receiver operator characteristic curve, we generate a coefficient called the area under the curve, or AUC for short, which ranges from 0 to 1. Empirical studies commonly produce AUC values for CBM reading in the upper 0.80s to low 0.90s, where 0.85 is considered strong evidence of classification accuracy. So isn't it amazing that something as basic and easy to measure as oral reading rate from a well-designed reading passage can predict who will be successful on a reading comprehension test? The results I've summarized are not limited to CBM reading. For example, a simple CBM task administered in the winter of kindergarten in which students say letter sounds is highly predictive of word reading skills in grade 1, which in turn is predictive of reading success for grade 3. In a similar way, mental computation, as assessed with math addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division facts, is predictive of overall math achievement. In fact, number sense skills like those assessed with math CBM were recognized by the National Math Advisory Panel as critical for success in formal algebra. As you consider a formative assessment system, be sure to review the technical documentation, especially related to predictive validity, classification accuracy, and the sensitivity, reliability, and validity of the growth data. And good luck. Thank you. I'll pass it on.
Thanks, John. I am going to take over here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be sharing with all of you today. I will be focusing my part of the presentation on how formative assessment helps students. I'm going to talk about formative assessment and how it can be used to create a powerful feedback loop, its use for documentation, and how it can lead you through making next steps for creating success for your students. Next slide. In order to understand what students are learning, we need to assess them somehow. And through these assessments, we have to determine if the students are learning what they need to know and at an adequate growth rate. We ask, are they on track to meet grade level benchmarks or expectations? We need this type of information in real time throughout this year so that, for example, if students aren't learning, we can modify teaching and learning activities to meet their needs. Formative assessment is an effective way to do this. It acts as a feedback loop throughout the school year to track student progress and change what we do to support students. So really, it allows us to monitor students' growth toward learning targets and provide ongoing feedback about the progress made over that time such that that information gathered changes what we do as educators to support students in learning what they need to learn. As a part of this feedback process, we need to consider motivation and goals. First, both teachers and students should have an understanding of learning targets or those goals. Clear goals make it easy to know what is expected across time. We can see the pathway of what small steps can be made to continue growing to meet incremental goals that lead to learning target goals over fall to winter to spring. Students get to see this too. Students who understand their learning goals understand the purpose of instruction, and this can increase their motivation. Their motivation may also be increased as they see their progress on assessments administered. It can also increase motivation for teachers because they get to know what their students know and what they don't know that needs to still be taught. It's not a mystery anymore. You can actually see where your students are. Next slide. Another powerful feature of formative assessment is using it to document how well students are doing over time. Progress data tell a story about how well students are doing in meeting learning targets at one time period and then across time as data are gathered. We can know which of our students are meeting established learning targets across the year and know which students are not meeting these targets. Then we can use this documented information to revise and improve how we instruct and support students. This is a continuous process of reviewing and revising. One specific way we think about using progress data is its important role in documenting whether an intervention is working. So in short, progress data tell a story about what we can do in real time and across time to improve student outcomes. We aren't left clueless or feel like we don't know what is or isn't working for our students. By looking at progress data for students, we can know what is working and what we need to do differently or keep the same to meet each student's needs week to week of a school year. Another aspect of this is that formative assessment can and should support long-term planning for individual students, classes, schools, and even district level planning. This long-term planning includes planning such as core curriculum and instruction, identifying students in need of intervention and which supplemental interventions to use, and really just how resources will be allocated in general. These are critical decisions that must be made, and knowing that you have reliable and valid data to inform these decisions because it documents where students are at in their learning can make you feel confident in making these decisions. Data also can specifically assist with eligibility decisions. So as a school psychologist, I spend quite a bit of my time looking at data and asking teachers for data to document if a student is not making adequate progress. One of the important reasons for this is that I need data on students who are being referred for special education evaluations. I need to know and have proper documentation of what interventions were conducted and if the student made progress or not. This data can be a part of the information used to determine if a student meets the eligibility criteria for a specific learning disability and can even drive IEP development by using this data to determine current performance levels for a student and even to set measurable goals. Next slide. Another important use of formative assessment to help students is how it leads us through determining next steps related to problem solving, providing less or more support to students, and in the end, being able to celebrate successes. At a basic level, we use formative assessment data as an essential part of problem solving. Using a problem-solving approach can help us figure out which of our students need more support and which need less support. It can seem complicated given all the moving pieces, and I'm not going to go too much into this, but as we get to see this work together, it can create an environment in which students are learning and achieving at grade level. One way to break this down is to use data gathered following a problem-solving approach. We do this by identifying a problem, analyzing what that problem is, developing a plan to solve the problem, implementing that plan, and then evaluating to see if that plan worked. In order for this approach to work, we need data. Data informs this process. So to put this in context, I want to share a story with you about a school district and then one particular school within that where using formative assessment over time made a huge difference for them. This particular district had been using fast-bridge learning for at least 3 years, I think, and they recognized that across a period of time that they had a district level problem that they needed to solve. In particular, what they were looking at is their kindergarten universal screening data, which within this is a few early reading measures and composite score that looks at things like letter sound knowledge, onset sounds, nonsense words, and how well students are doing within those areas. And what they observed was that their kindergarten scores showed a consistent drop between how students were doing in the fall versus where they ended up in winter. So that is, more students from fall to winter were now falling at a high risk or some risk for not being on track. So for example, they might have, I think they were seeing about 40% of their students being at benchmark in the fall, and then by the winter, only 20% were at benchmark. So this raised a flag for them at the district level because all schools, I think there was about 10, were having difficulty with this area. So what they did is they decided to dig deeper and analyze their data. They convened a district-wide team to look at the problem, and this team included kindergarten teachers and teachers across the grades. And what they did was examine the data that they had. They began to figure out that how the curriculum was implemented within schools and classrooms was inconsistent, and there was no specific guidance or a clear scope and sequence for how to teach things like letter sounds or other specific skills needed for early reading. At the same time, they found one teacher at a school site that did show growth in letter sounds, and she was using a systematic program for teaching letter sounds, which was done at a rapid pace and with a clear sequence. The K team at that district level therefore decided to work together to create a curriculum to be used by all the teachers based upon what this particular teacher did, who was demonstrating significant success. So they didn't even buy another curriculum. What they did was work together to create something that would work for them based upon the data that they had. They also set up progress monitoring groups for all of their kindergarten students in letter sounds. And based on this significant work, over the course of 2 years, they observed growth. The following year, 46% of kindergarten students were at or above benchmark in winter versus that 20% before. And then moreover, about 60% of students were at or above benchmark with those letter sounds versus 30% the year before. One of the most powerful aspects of what I saw through this shared case study was how teachers began to really buy in to the power of formative assessment and how it enabled change to happen in real time for what they did in their classrooms. They saw the growth and were motivated to continue with the process of solving the problem, which was still something that they saw needing to happen so that all of their students, 100%, were making those benchmarks. I shared this particular example for a couple reasons. First, helping students by using formative assessment does occur over time. It doesn't happen overnight, right? This took the district a few years to really drill down to determine how to best solve the problem that they were observing just at the kindergarten class level. Second, this example shows how many different pieces must work together across leadership at a school, even the district, down to teacher commitment to make this change happen. Problems like this aren't solved overnight, but through committed work across time. Within each week, each month, and each school year, there are successes of student growth to celebrate, and this shouldn't be overlooked. We have to focus on celebrating those small growth steps while also still keeping our mind on how to continue improving what we do so students are attaining learning targets across grades. This is really how formative assessment enables learning for all students. Next slide. All right, Rachel, and I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. So hopefully you have had an opportunity to learn about the technical features of formative assessment, particularly curriculum-based measures, and then also how those features can harness the power of collecting data at regular intervals over time in order to provide a feedback loop and critical information for both students and teachers about student learning. What I'm going to do now is talk about how formative assessment fits into a multi-tiered system of support. And there are 3 specific areas that I want to focus on in this part of our presentation. One is the extent to which formative assessment and an MTSS have the capacity to support all students. In addition, I want to talk about how these procedures are data-driven and that is partly how they go about the work of supporting all students. And then finally, the extent to which having a data system that is able to be used in real time helps provide teachers with timely support. And that's really important, because if teachers have the data quickly and they understand it, they're going to be able to turn it around and provide better supports to students. So one of the key things about tiered supports is that these are systems that are designed to support all students. This is an important distinction because for many of us, and certainly for me, at the beginning of my teaching career, it was the case that if a student was struggling, generally there was an assumption that the student had a disability, and therefore a referral was made to special education. And that was the only type of individualized support a student might be able to access. The problem with that particular model is the fact that students can struggle in school for many reasons. However, not all of those reasons are that the student has a specific disability. For example, a student might be in a family that has had to move very frequently as a result of the parents changing jobs. Or a child might be part of a military family where one or both parents have been deployed overseas. All of these are events that could have a significant effect on the student's learning outcomes, but which are not disabilities. And so by casting a wider net with regard to how we structure supports for students, we can create methods that make it possible for us to pay attention to the needs of all students and not necessarily make the assumption that every student who struggles has a disability. This is a pretty dramatic change that has been occurring over the last 10 to 15 years. And for some, it can be a fairly radical shift in thinking. However, I believe it is a much more authentic approach to how we provide supports to students and go about the work of providing effective public education, because it embraces the reality that we have very diverse classrooms and students with many different types of needs, some of whom have disabilities and for whom special education was designed, and others of whom don't have disabilities but still need individualized or small group instruction in order for them to be successful in school. So a core component of any system of supports is going to be the ways in which it's set up so that it can provide supports for 100% of students in your school. The way that it does this is through data. And that is the pathway then that we use to help make decisions about which students need support and which students are on a path to reach specific learning goals across a particular school year. Data, of course, provide us with an objective way to think about which students need help or don't need help. And this, again, is somewhat different from more traditional practices where teachers may have had to depend on their own judgment in order to come to a conclusion about which students, in fact, needed some types of support. The data sources that we can use within an MTSS begin at the universal screening level. And universal screening is, in fact, a form of formative assessment because it is conducted usually 3 times a year. Universal screening is a process where we have all students in a grade level complete the same assessment so that we can compare the results across all students who are enrolled at the same grade. This is different than other types of assessment, for example, a teacher-made classroom test, which would only provide information for students in that class who received that teacher's instruction. Universal screening assessments provide us with a way to make comparisons across all kids in the same grade who, by definition, are expected to meet the same grade level learning goals. And so universal screening serves as that first point where we're going to use student data to help us be objective about which students need support. Then the next step is going to be to look at those screening scores and identify which students appear to be struggling and what kinds of additional instruction they need. In this way, an MTSS is a very student-focused way to help students be successful in schools. And we certainly want to recommend that when folks are looking at their screening data, they also take into account other sources of information that they have about students, because it should never be the case that we make important decisions about instruction on the basis of one test score. We need to consider a range of sources of information about students so that we can come to data-driven conclusions about what types of instruction a student needs. For those students who in fact do participate in some form of supplemental intervention and support, we can then use an additional type of formative assessment, which is progress monitoring. And this is what John was telling about when he explained how it's a very effective way to keep track of student improvements during the time they participate in intervention. And so progress monitoring is another type of data that teams would use in order to determine if a student is making the gains expected or if some other type of instruction needs to happen. When we look at progress monitoring data, we always want to keep in mind certain key features to make sure that the information that's in front of us is in fact accurate and reliable. So for example, making sure that the student actually attended school on a regular basis, because if the student wasn't there to participate in the instruction, then we really shouldn't try to interpret the data. Also, how accurately was the intervention implemented? Because if the intervention wasn't done as intended, the scores may not be that meaningful or important for us to look at. But all of these are examples of how we can use objective data as well as team-based decision-making to come up with student-focused learning goals and interventions. Another important piece of tiered supports is that they're able to provide supports for students that are going to be very timely. And this really works both ways, because timely support is important to the students as well as to the teachers. And for this reason, we recommend that for students who participate in intervention, they also complete weekly progress monitoring assessments so that there will be data at a frequent enough interval in order for teachers to see whether or not intervention is working. You might recall that John mentioned that in as little as 6 data points, teachers can know if an intervention is working. Well, the frequency of those data points is going to have a huge effect on whether or not the information is really timely. If you collect progress monitoring data once a month and you need at least 6 data points, you would need at least 6 months in order to be at a place where you could sit down and evaluate outcomes. However, if you collect data weekly, you would be able to look at those data in as short as 6 weeks' time. That's a huge difference when it comes to a student who's been struggling in school and in making sure that those interventions, in fact, are working for the student. This then provides a much more immediate feedback loop. This definitely connects to what Lynn was explaining about in terms of the importance that students and teachers have access to seeing how they're doing. And so that frequent progress monitoring data serves to let us know, hey, we're on track, this is awesome. Or, oops, we're not on track, what do we need to change? And this is where I would argue that tiered supports help us as educators to have a success focus for all students, because then we can be very thoughtful and objective about what kinds of instruction each student needs and establish learning goals to help support each of those students so that they can reach appropriate year-long learning goals. So, as you probably figured out, Fastbridge Learning has a number of resources that can support formative assessment in schools as part of a tiered system of supports. And many of our tools are, in fact, curriculum-based measures, but we also have some computer adaptive tests that can be used as part of universal screening. When you pair the computer adaptive tests as a universal screening measure with curriculum-based measures for progress monitoring, you have a really great combination of tools that then inform your data-driven decision-making for all students. And so I hope that this information has been helpful for you today in learning about what is formative assessment, what it's not, how it can help students, and how it fits into a system of tiered supports. I'm going to hand it back over to Emily for some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel, and to John and Lynn as well for helping us unpack formative assessment and sharing how it can be used to inform instruction and support students. I think one of the main highlights that came out for me there was at the end, Rachel, just talking about how formative assessment can really help us intervene early and prevent students from struggling with all kinds of reading and math and other issues so that we can help them accomplish all that's possible. So I think this was great information. And as a reminder to everybody, you will get a copy of the slide deck and the recording. So keep an eye out for an email about that information tomorrow. So we do have some questions that have come in, and it looks like we'll have some time to take some more if folks have them and want to send them in through that questions feature on your control panel. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first came in pretty early and was kind of part of the definition of formative assessment. And it is, what is the difference between formative assessment and classroom assessment?
This is Rachel, and I'll go ahead and take that, and then John or Lynn, if you want to tag on to that, that's great. Basically, classroom assessment is a type of formative assessment, because formative assessment really is any assessment that's done at specified regular intervals with a measure that can be compared over time so that you can see how students are doing. So both universal screening and weekly progress monitoring are examples of formative assessment, but so is a classroom assessment. The major difference is that a classroom assessment is something that would only be interpretable in relation to the kids in that class, because it needs to be done in light of what instruction did they receive over what period of time. And so classroom assessments are really important, and we encourage teachers to keep using them, but they're limited in terms of how much we can compare that data if we want to keep tabs on all the kids, say, in a particular grade or in a particular school. So for that reason, we would encourage the use of classroom tests as part of formative assessment, but we would also encourage the use of screening assessments and progress monitoring assessments for selected students, so that you can have that bigger sense of how are all students doing.
Thank you for clarifying that, Rachel. This question may also be for you because it came in when you were talking. You mentioned at the very beginning how, when you were talking about the myth that students don't like testing, that students can get excited and be motivated by the assessments and wanting to see if they've approved. This educator has shared that they don't typically share assessment results with their students, and wondered if you could talk a little bit about a process for looping students in on the results of the assessments and their progress.
Excellent question. And I can share that when I was a young teacher, it never would have occurred to me to share that, test results with students, especially, the test results that are not classroom assessments. Because it just felt like that was a breach of protocol, and we might share things with parents, but not with students. Over time, what I realized is we were missing out on one of the best possible ways to help students engage and be invested in their own learning, and to take advantage of the motivation that comes when they know how things are doing in a timely manner. And so I've shifted my thinking pretty radically, and therefore began making sure that all students, in an age-appropriate way, had some feedback about how they were doing in school. And one of the best tools for that is a progress monitoring graph. And you can use a graph whether you're looking at screening data or weekly progress monitoring data, simply because it's going to show, either with a bar graph or a line graph, the direction of the student's work. And is it going up or is it going down? And I've done this with kids as young as kindergarten, because they too can understand the direction on a graph in relation to what's the goal. And there's actually a pretty extensive body of research about how timely, immediate feedback about student performance can in and of itself be another motivator. Because let's assume that the interventions, the instruction is working, and in most of the time they will. This is something I can share after doing this for many years. That then is creating more motivation for students to keep doing that because they can see how well it's worked. And then some folks will say, well, what if it's not working? Isn't that going to be a disincentive? Well, I'll be honest, if it's not working, that kid has a right not to be happy, and we should, do everything we can to make a change, because if the student is putting in his or her best effort and it's not working, we, the educators, have the responsibility to change something. Yes, I realize that there are issues around motivation, attendance, and so forth, and I'm not negating those factors in student performance and improvement. But as a general principle, including students in the review of their own data, to me, is a very helpful way, and one that they really appreciate and value because they can see the fruits of their own hard work.
I think that was an excellent explanation, Rachel, and I think it is so important to make sure that we're involving our children in their own learning and helping them take ownership of that. So those were some helpful suggestions. Okay, next question. How often or frequently are you recommending that you give these 1-minute assessments? And there is, and John, this may be a kind of follow-up question that you may want to answer. Some folks asked, how can a 1-minute assessment provide useful information with it just being so brief?
That's kind of the amazing part about oral reading fluency, which honestly, when I got into the assessment arena many, many years ago, I certainly believed in general achievement testing and what it could do at the end of the year, summative assessments, at least for tracking the kind of information and knowledge a student has. And I was suspicious myself about this thing called CBM until I started looking at the data. And I was just amazed by how much validity, predictive validity, classification accuracy, so good decision making can be based on a 1-minute reading test. And we actually have done research to try to find better ways to assess reading that would provide even stronger predictive validity and more diagnostic information than an oral reading fluency test. And it's been hard to find those, although we've been working at FastBridge on some other purely computer administered techniques to try to augment or maybe even improve on what we can do with oral reading fluency. But in addition to just getting a score that is both predictive of end of year achievement, the rate at which a student improves has also been shown to be predictive of how students will perform at the end of the year. So there's just a lot of empirical evidence supporting it. And then of course there are the error analysis components of something like oral reading fluency, but other measures, we've got a lot of basic reading and basic math assessments. Some of them are very narrowly defined because the skills that they're assessing are critical foundational skills that by themselves are predictive. For example, naming letters and things like that. But the errors that come out of a student's performance can also help form how you might intervene or instruct with that student, because if they're missing certain letters consistently, they might, they're going to be exposed for 1 minute to a bunch of letters. There's 26 letters in the alphabet, but they might see 100 stimuli. And if they're consistently missing a single letter or a set of letters, that tells you something that they are not familiar with those letters. So there is the other additional information on the error analysis that also comes out of these short 1-minute assessments.
Great, thank you. And actually just circling back around to the start of that question, how frequently are you recommending that you give the assessments? Does it vary per child?
Yeah, okay, so back to that. Yeah, I think, and then Rachel, you can jump in on this too, or whatever. When a student is in an intensive intervention scenario, so they're getting pretty intensive intervention, really weekly assessment is recommended. Research that we've conducted looking at daily assessments, some people used to do daily oral reading assessment or in other areas. It really doesn't add too much to the predictive validity or utility of the information. But as Rachel pointed out, if you push that back too much to monthly, that's a common approach for kids that are receiving supplemental, maybe at moderate risk. The problem with that is it's also, you need certain number of data points. So I don't want to get too technical, but if you only have 2 data points, you can always fit a perfect line. You need at least 3 to have any kind of variability in that line. And all of the research that we've done, simulation and other research, shows that 4 data points over 6 weeks is a minimum to start to establish highly accurate predictions of where students' trajectory or where they're going in the future. So we say weekly assessment, and really to assess for no fewer than 4 to 6 weeks before you start making decisions.
Thank you. That was definitely helpful, and I answered that question for our attendee. Next question, is performance testing part of formative assessment? And can you give an example of an effective performance assessment in language arts?
This is Rachel. I guess there could be so many ways to define performance assessments, but in many respects, a number of our curriculum-based measures are performance assessments. And what I mean by that is, for our individually administered curriculum-based measures, the student is performing the skill, the target skill, in real time. And so you have an authentic example of the student's skill set. And that is true certainly in, the curriculum-based measurement of reading, which John has talked about just how powerful it is. The student is reading out loud, and the teacher is able to listen to that. So it's a real-time, authentic example. We also have that, for example, we have some computer-based curriculum-based measures where the task is to solve some math problems. Well, the student is providing the answer right there in real time, so that we get a sense of their performance of that skill. We broaden that out a little bit with our computer adaptive tests, because those are intentionally designed to be very broad assessments of many types of skills, and that's partly why they're not good for progress monitoring, but are really good for tapping into all the different things students have been exposed to in a given year. The downside to those in terms of the great specificity is that for any given instance, the student may not have an opportunity to answer a question for everything they've learned in the last 8 to 12 weeks. So that may not fit as closely with that question about performance assessment. But certainly our curriculum-based measures are designed to be authentic examples of the student's performance of the skill, so that teachers can know in real time, A, do they know how to do it, and B, if not, what kinds of errors are being made. Certainly if John or Lynn, if you have another perspective on that, I'd welcome it.
I don't have much to add, and I thought you actually were right on the mark in that a lot of the CBMs that we use are performance tasks. So the kids actually perform the task, and oftentimes being observed by the examiner. I think there are other kinds of performance assessments that get into lots of information that might be require 15, 20, 30 minutes of evaluation. And I think that would be another type of formative assessment that goes beyond what we were intending to talk about today, but probably a valuable assessment for diagnosing where students' strengths and weaknesses might be. I think in terms of providing ongoing assessment and monitoring the progress of the student, it just wouldn't be an effective or efficient way to do that.
I'll actually just tag team on that for a brief moment, because you did ask about performance assessment in English language arts. We do have a couple of assessments that are still part of our suite of lab-based tools that we are doing some additional field testing to see how they'll perform, but which are very explicitly designed to evaluate student performance in various reading tasks using a computer-based interface. Those two, in some respects, would be performance-based assessments. It's a different twist because they're computer-based, not individually administered. But we are looking for ways to capture information about the broad range of reading skills that we know a student needs to have that include everything from phonemic awareness through to comprehension. And we look forward to, in the next year or two, launching those as additional tools that might be helpful for teachers in the English language arts area.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think that definitely is a good example of how much research does go into all of the assessments that are part of the FAST system. So, you can really trust that data that's coming out of them. Let's see, Lynn, this is a question that came in for you, though John and Rachel, feel free to chime in. Who typically administers scores and interprets formative assessments?
That's a good question. I think the goal is, one where it would involve potentially, depending on the way that you set up your school, a team of individuals. So that would include potentially even your principal, your instructional coach, your leaders, and then as well as teachers. So I think really it should be a team approach, especially as everyone starts to learn about the assessments and what they mean. And I think the power really lies in figuring out and making sure that teachers do begin to use that data so that they then can see and use it closely to provide that feedback loop for their students. And so I think in the end, really, the goal should be to be able to get teachers in classrooms to be able to administer and then also be able to interpret that data.
All right. Rachel and John, do you have anything you'd want to add to that?
Well, Lynn really covered it nicely. I mean, the FAST system literally was designed with the teacher in mind. That was the key principle behind the work that created these tools.
And that shows up in the name of it as well. All right, it looks like we've got time for just one more question. And I think it's open to any of you, but how do you determine which assessments are best to use with the different issues that a child may be having?
Lynn, do you want to speak to that? I'm happy to, but I didn't know if you wanted to follow up in terms of your case example.
Sure. This can be a tricky area to figure out. And for one of the reasons is that there are quite a few different formative assessments, and really what it should be is targeted towards what area you're intervening in as much as it can be, but then you also have to consider looking at being able to see growth over time on a more broad measure. So for example, you might be using CBM reading depending on what intervention you're doing. But if you're doing early reading skills, this is where we do have quite a few assessments available in the system that are targeted more towards the different areas. So for example, if you're doing an intervention in phonics specific to letter sounds, you can use a letter sound or in the early reading suite to progress monitor. If you're doing more of a reading fluency intervention or maybe a higher level phonics even, then you might want to switch to using CBM reading. So I think it really depends on what you're doing for your intervention and making sure to look in and read about the assessments to figure out what's going to be a best match.
Excellent. And I would totally agree. I mean, the key is to match assessment with instruction. And we do have a wide array of additional resources for folks who subscribe to the FAST system through our online knowledge base that goes into details about some of that to help folks know when, for example, it might be time to change a selected assessment for various reasons.
Great. Well, thank you. I am sad to say we have reached the end of our time together, but thank you again, Rachel, John, and Lynn, for joining us today and for fielding these questions that came in. And thanks to everybody in our audience who took the time out of their busy days to join us for this webinar. Again, you'll receive an email tomorrow around the same time that will include a link to the presentation deck and to the recording, so keep an eye out for that. And if you are interested in learning more about the FAST system, you can go to fastbridge.org and you'll find lots of information and sample reports and details on all of the assessments on the website. Also, the Fast Insights blog is a wonderful resource for just learning about all types of things in regards to assessments, and it can be real helpful to your practice. So I encourage you to take a look at both the website and the blog. And as a final reminder, also keep an eye on your inbox for more information about our webinar coming up on April 3rd about early identification and intervention of reading disabilities like dyslexia. We will start to open registration for that very soon. So thanks again for joining us. And we did actually have one last question come in, which was, will you get a certificate of attendance? And the answer to that is yes. Just keep an eye out for that email tomorrow, and you'll get a link to download that. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.